Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Josh Curzan, and my wife and my family are here today as well. Oh, my wife. And afterwards, she'll be able to share. So thank you for being here today. It's an awesome honor to speak with you guys. I was included in this a little. Oh, thank you so much. That's the sound it makes. I was recently included in on this, and I'm honored to be part of it. So what I'm going to do today is speak to you a bit about. I'm a tall guy. Thanks. The history of Juneteenth and its relationship to our town of Portland, as well as why we're actually gathered here today. So there's an African proverb, and it was made famous by a Nigerian author, Chinua Achebe, who wrote Things Fall Apart. Maybe some of you are familiar with that book. I really recommend that you read it. But the African proverb goes, until the lion tells his side of the story, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. I say this quote because what is the story of the lion? Nations, even small municipalities as ours, they oftentimes sanitize history, making it more palatable for people to learn. And they speak only of the hunter. It is not always done with malice, however. Sometimes it's simply merely the fact that the proverbial lion has not been allowed to actually speak. So without any intention of taking away from the genius of the founding fathers that we all know from our history books and the ideas of liberty that forged our nation, because we are a great nation, the reality, though, is that many people could not truly enjoy these freedoms that were so eloquently stated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States. But one of the most important documents of history that should be put up there with those documents that we revere so much is the Emancipation Proclamation. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and how it relates to Juneteenth. The Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 freed about 4 million African Americans who were enslaved in the southern states. But it did not end slavery, because what happened is, still in places like Texas and pockets deep in the South, there were slaves that were still held on plantations 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by Abraham Lincoln. These slaves did not know that they had been freed according to the Emancipation Proclamation, and there were about 250,000 slaves that were still held in bondage in Texas in the deep South. It's also important for you to know that the Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery in this country. However, it symbolized freedom for African Americans. Juneteenth, this day, 155 years ago, in sweltering heat, probably worse than this because it was Texas, a Union general comes into Galveston, Texas. His name was General Gordon Granger, with about 1,800 troops. And he came to tell the Africans who were held in bondage there, the enslaved African Americans, that they were free. And they had no idea. This was 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. To put it into perspective as well, it was almost 4 months after General Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee, and we know his statues have been in the news lately, at Appomattox Courthouse, which pretty much brought an end to the Civil War. And still after that, you had many Confederates who had brought their slaves and to regions of Texas. When the people found out they were free, they celebrated, and it was an honored day for African Americans to acknowledge that freedom had come. And with that announcement, it began the first time where the United States actually took a firm stance in admitting it's wrong with slavery. It also opened the way for the abolition of slavery, which is actually the 13th Amendment, as well as the 14th Amendment, which allowed African Americans to become citizens of the United States. It also allowed for the 15th Amendment, which enfranchised black voters. black men at this time, because women of all colors and backgrounds were not allowed to vote yet. Of course, even though these freedoms were won, there was still a dark history that we have to acknowledge in American history. After this Reconstruction and some of these liberties were won, you had the Jim Crow era, you had lynching, you had racial terrorism, you had voter discrimination, and all these things have lasted all the way through the 20th century, the 21st century, through the civil rights movement, that when we think in the 60s it was all done, there are still things that we have to acknowledge and recognize and understand. As black Americans fled the South and migrated north to cities like in the Northeast and other areas, they also brought with them this celebration of Juneteenth, because it acknowledged the first time that they could enjoy some of the liberty that was supposedly had been promised. 47 states now observe it. Connecticut did in 2003. Texas did officially in 1980. And the most recent state to do it has been New Hampshire in 2019. But many people have never heard of Juneteenth before. And the reason why is because it was traditionally celebrated often in African American communities in the South. But also, we really have had a hard time celebrating it, because you can't celebrate it without acknowledging the dark history of America. So we confront those realities today on Juneteenth. I want to take a moment to tie this back to Portland, Connecticut. We all live in Portland, or we are visiting Portland right now. I want you to think a moment about our Portland brownstone. Our Portland brownstone. There were people in this country, as dark as this brownstone, who did not have their freedom. And I want you to think about the fact that they did not enjoy the equal rights and opportunities, even if they were free people of color living in Connecticut and living in this town at the time. This Portland brownstone, prized for its beauty, was not still valued in the skin tone and complexion of people that even lived in this town. In Portland, in 1860, there were 3,657 residents. 10 of those people were free people of color. According to the 1860 census, there were 5 free men of color and 5 free women of color in this small town of 3,000 and change. During the Civil War, Connecticut fielded 30 regiments. And while the majority of volunteers from Connecticut probably did not go into the war to emancipate slaves, there were certainly some who did. And one of these units was the 29th Colored Regiment, as well as the beginnings of the 30th Colored Regiment, because the 29th Colored Regiment completely filled to capacity. And these were the colored infantry of soldiers who could fight for the first time, because they were not allowed to fight before, even for freedom, in our country. 78% of eligible black men enrolled in the 29th and 30th regiments in Connecticut, even though a lot of these black laborers were paid probably more than they would earn in the Army. They were mustered on March 1864. Both groups of soldiers, totaling about 1,700 men, served heroically until the end of the war, sustaining 600 casualties, and they faced unequal pay. They didn't get paid the same amount as white soldiers. Frederick Douglass, who I hope you all know, and if you don't, that's going to be a whole other speech. But he spoke to the troops in New Haven, and he said this: "You are the pioneers of the liberty of your race. If you rise and flourish, we shall rise and flourish. If you win freedom and citizenship, we shall share your freedom and citizenship." According to the troop enlistments for Connecticut during the Civil War, 2 colored soldiers in the 29th Regiment were born here in Portland, Connecticut. They were both farmers. One's name was Alfred L. Mosley. He was 20 years old. Another was David Thomas, 24 years old. 6 more colored soldiers who resided in Portland, Connecticut, joined the 30th Regiment. They were born in different places, some coming directly from the South. 2 were sailors. One was a farmer, a cook, a waiter, and a stone cutter. You can probably imagine what stone he was cutting. They ranged in ages from 20 to 43. Now I want you to consider the fact that just a few years earlier, In 1860, it was said that 5 free colored men lived in town. And so it's quite possible that every free man of color in town who was eligible volunteered in the fight to end slavery. So after serving heroically in General Grant's campaign in Virginia, they sailed to Texas. These same troops from Connecticut, and some likely from Portland, sailed to Texas just a couple weeks after the very first Juneteenth Day, 155 years ago. And they served there until the end of their duty to kind of maintain law and order in this newly occupied part of the rebellious South. But the story doesn't end there for those colored troops of Connecticut and of Portland, Connecticut. Just 1 month before returning to Hartford, Connecticut, in November 1865, just behind us on the Connecticut River, boats came up bringing soldiers to Hartford to be honorably discharged, the 29th Colored Regiment and the 31st Regiment. However, just a couple months before that, Connecticut had rejected a proposed amendment to the state's constitution that would have given blacks the right to vote. It was blocked, so they would remain disenfranchised. These men were not allowed to vote until 1870 with the adoption of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution. One more legacy of racial intolerance, even those that actually fought for their freedom and were active in it. So why remember Juneteenth, especially in a small, mostly white community? Well, we're all connected, and we want to remove obstacles that way in the way of making others feel welcomed in our community, to make sure that there's always a seat at the table. We are a community that should be motivated to secure full independence and equality for all people. Emancipation was one step forward toward full equality, but in many ways, African Americans and other people of color remain in a form of bondage. Poor education, lack of access to proper health care, a massive racial wealth gap, and biased sentencing and criminal justice continue to affect minorities at disproportionate rates. Today is an opportunity to acknowledge a history that shaped and influenced our society today. If we learn from one another, then we can make lasting improvements. We need to fight for equality, face hard truths, and struggle to end racial injustice. We should honor the lives of enslaved African Americans and of their descendants, and those who fight for the equal rights and celebrate this day of freedom. Making sure that our history is told is critical to supporting and sustaining our growth as a people. This is why Juneteenth is part of our American story. It centers people of African descent in a way that puts Black freedom struggle in the middle of the American story. It tells a story that is often overshadowed by how we have culturally celebrated the supposed noble and heroic men of the Confederacy, for example, or how we have celebrated the hard work and determination of European immigrants only, while failing to recognize the toil and constant discrimination that enslaved Africans, their descendants, and other people from other parts of the world had to face as well. We don't need to replace or rewrite history. We just need to speak the lion's side of the story and offer it up as equally significant. Even in our small town, the lion's story is largely unknown. Sometimes we can't see how things will change, especially if you watch the news. Before the Emancipation Proclamation and before this day of Juneteenth 155 years ago, slavery was something that most people thought would last forever in this country. But suddenly, the Emancipation Proclamation and its announcement in Galveston, Texas, 2.5 years later, put America on a trajectory that ultimately led us to a fundamental change in citizenship and equality. And so what I hope for, and I'm sure that all of you hope for, is that people would realize that they have a right to demand and affect change, because change is possible in this country, especially on this day, the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth. Thank you.